Welcome everybody to another in our series of video chats that primarily intended for the Half Earth Project Educator Ambassador Program. This is really meant to give students and teachers some insight into conservation thinking, conservation action. And I have two great guests with me today who are involved with the Half Earth Project, and they're both experts in a particular aspect of the project that involves mapping and informatics to make, basically I'd say to improve conservation thinking and conservation decision making. So I'm going to let them introduce themselves in a minute here, but first I want to say, hi Jen, how are you doing?
Hi, doing well, thank you.
Good.
How are you?
I'm doing well too. Good to see you. And Scott, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Dennis. Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
happy
good.
to be here.
And that is somehow you're combining an interest in nature and ecology and conservation, and you're combining that with computing and mathematics and informatics thinking. So maybe, Jen, do you want to start off and tell us just a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm Jennifer McGowan. I'm currently the Spatial Planning and Technical Coordinator at the Nature Conservancy based here in Washington, D.C. I think probably my path to here started back in 6th grade when I went and visited Muir Woods, and it was really my first time. It's a park in Northern California, and it was my first time in nature, and I think it did have one of those transformative effects. And I knew at that point in time, you know, the field that I'm in now wasn't really an option. It didn't really exist, this idea of kind of geospatial conservation and conservation tech.
Yeah.
And so I pursued a degree in environmental studies because that seemed to be the most relevant to what I was interested in, which was, you know, nature conservation. And then I ended up going back to graduate school to learn GIS and get my master's degree in geography. And it was through the combination of geography and mapping and learning this sort of emerging technology at the time, which was geographic information systems, that led me into my PhD topic, which is about spatial conservation, planning, prioritization, and decision science. And through that, I started to learn about algorithms and different softwares that help support decision-making for conservation. And I've brought all of that with me now into my position at the Nature Conservancy, and I really help our strategies around the world try and prioritize action planning and spatial planning for nature and people.
That's great. No, boy, there's lots of things we could dig into. I love though that piece of the story, that 6th grade, those middle years can be really, I think they can be really critical. And you know, sadly, that's often when people decide like, you know, oh, I don't think I'm a science person, for example. So that time is really important. Thanks so much. How about you, Scott? What's your story?
Yeah, I think there are a lot of parallels in my story with Jen's. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, so I actually bounced around between Oregon and Montana and Washington, and spent a lot of time outdoors with my family, did a lot of road trips around the area. It was always sort of an omnipresent background and always pretty readily accessible. And so I think from a very early age, I was taught an appreciation and reverence for the outdoors, and to foster my own personal connection with it. And so that's always been something that's been very special to me. Academically, as I grew up and sort of found my way through school, I found out very quickly that I was very interested and reasonably good at math and associated things. And so I got my undergraduate degree in pure mathematics. But when I decided to go on to graduate school, I really sort of began to wonder, you know, is there some way in which I could use these mathematical and quantitative skills that I have to apply them to some kind of environmental kind of science, like making the world better through math, you know?
Right.
And just like Jen said, I had absolutely no idea if such a field even existed. But it turned out that I found a program in quantitative ecology and resource management, and I went through graduate school there, got my PhD in sort of applications to landscape ecology, studying very broad patterns in space and time. Which brings me now to my current position as a research scientist at the Yale Center for Biodiversity and Global Change, and working on the Half-Earth Project in particular, and using conservation planning in order to figure out which half we need.
Yeah, well, that's great. And the project is so happy to have you. And even though Jen mentioned her primary appointment is with the Nature Conservancy, but also I know she's contributing through the Map of Life team at Yale, your team. She's going to be contributing a certain amount of her time directly to the Half-Earth Project. When I go around speaking, doing workshops and things, mostly for teachers and some with students, I always, the very first questions that come to anyone is why half and which half? And in part to turn, Ed Wilson's book, Half Earth, to turn that into a project. One of the early things that the foundation did was to make the decision and raise funds to make this Half Earth map. And all I wanted to do is point out the map, and that the three primary layers of this digital map are a biodiversity layer, an existing protection layer, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today, and then a human pressures layer. So one of the first questions, I just wanted to show this slide, which was a word diagram done by students responding to the question, when you hear protected areas or you hear protection, what do you think of? And I think these answers are really, they're really interesting and a little bit of an insight into how people think of protection. So we're going to start off sort of defining what we mean by protection, and then Jen's going to get a little bit into the history and how some of these ideas are evolving. So it's important to know about IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is an international body. So this is a global effort to sort of, in some ways, part of their role is to define how we even think about nature and conserving nature. So a protected area is clearly defined space and using various means to conserve ecosystems. So it's a pretty good, concise definition. If you dig in a little bit to what IUCN talks about, obviously the top priority is conserving biodiversity. That's a big part of why we're all here talking today. When you talk about international agreements and you get into politics and economies, there's all sorts of important things about how do you govern and regulate these things, and equitability is an extremely important issue. It's also recognition that nature offers an awful lot to us, right? So even if your motivation is pragmatic or selfish, there's good reasons to be valuing nature. And also that, and I think Jennifer's going to, and Scott will get into this a little bit more, it's essential that we respect people. This is not, this is not something separate from people and the way we all live. And I just wanted one more slide on this just to show that that many members of our audience will be familiar, right? You may have a state park near you. There's national parks, or perhaps, in the US, that's the best known category of a protected area. But there's a lot of familiar places that are protected to conserve and protect biodiversity in particular.
And early national parks tended to be designated with the motivation of really protecting kind of iconic, irreplaceable landscapes like Yellowstone. And when you think of Yellowstone, you might think of wolves or buffalo or the geothermal pools if you've ever been to visit them. So really unique places in the landscape that are kind of known for their scenic beauty or their wildlife. We also see a lot of protected areas going up internationally to protect iconic species like elephants or lions. And this progressed through the 70s and 80s, and we saw a lot of national parks being declared as countries around the world started to realize the value of protecting biodiversity. And then we started to realize that even with the face of a growing protected area estate, we were still seeing species and biodiversity declining globally. And so we were kind of missing something. And the theory around where to put protected areas has now evolved quite substantially to not just being about, you know, scenic places where people want to go and picnic or iconic species, but to really celebrate and protect the diversity of life on the planet. And that means looking at more than just single species, looking at processes, looking at migration. I mean, we have species that cross boundaries. And so how do you start to integrate connectivity, migration routes, as well as social values? And so oftentimes in these high biodiversity areas, you do have indigenous communities, and they've been stewarding that land for a very long time. And there are very sacred sites that are important to their traditions and their cultures. And those are also factored in now to the protected area estate. So it's a much more comprehensive way of thinking about building out a network of sites. And then there's also an additional consideration being put in place really around the cost effectiveness, the costs and the feasibility associated with management and protection. And that's something that we can't ignore because it really affects the pragmatism and the constraints in which we are able to do conservation work. So as protected areas started emerging around the world, there was a recognition internationally that it would be good to have some kind of guiding principles or guiding frameworks that countries can aspire to and agree to and kind of mandate for themselves. And so one of those is the Convention for Biological Diversity. And in that Convention for Biological Diversity, which is the CBD sometimes, as it's called, there are different targets. And there's a particular target called IHE Target 11 that has to do with the protected area network globally. The World Database of Protected Areas is what the WDPA stands for. And that's basically the data set that has the mandate of trying to harvest and collect all of the information around the protected area network globally and keep it in one central repository and database and set standards for how that data is kind of collected and assimilated and then redistributed around the world for conservation planners to start using. And so this is just one of the things that they measure. They want to look at how much of every ecoregion. So ecoregions are broad geographic areas that are defined around the world. You can see those boundaries here across the different color bands, but the color bands reflect what level of protection each of those ecoregions is currently afforded. And so at the moment, you see that there's still a lot of places around the world that are sitting in reds and orange, and that means that they're low protection at the moment. Mm-hmm. And we really would like to get them up to meeting that target of 17%, which is embedded into the international policy commitments of the CBD for protected areas.
Jen, can I just ask a quick question about this data? So for example, for the United States, where does this data come from? Is it sort of collected at the state level, trickled up to the federal level, and then shared internationally? How does that work, just roughly?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it varies, I think, widely across countries, but there would be someone in government who is responsible for reporting up to the people who manage and maintain the WDPA.
Okay.
And so I should also mention that this does, one of the limitations of this is that by default, it doesn't capture a lot of the local community managed areas that exist that are really, really small, especially in the marine estate, in our oceans. We often have a lot of traditional management of the land and sea, and that might not get reflected in this data set. So that's something that is acknowledged and ongoing, and discussions are happening on how to correct for that.
Right. I think it's also worth pointing out that that You know, some areas of the world are better than others at their reporting. Some are lagging far behind, and we simply don't have that information. And so, in some sense, perhaps the WDPA offers a conservative estimate, and that as countries continue to add this information and share it the rest of the world with the rest of the world, we might see that number going up.
Yeah,
So,
it's
so
a big job.
Yeah. So one of the take homes, given there's caveats about this data, but one of the take homes is that by this analysis at the ecoregion level, we're at 9%. So we have a way to go to 17%, which is this CBD IHE Target 11. And of course, the context of our discussion is we want to get to half. But so this is where,
yeah, and just a clarifying point on that. So, so that representation, that 9% is looking at the average protection per ecosystem. So that's not just 9% of the planet is all we have protected. We actually have much more than that protected. But this concept of representation is really fundamental to thinking about the protected area network. It's really fundamental to how we think about conservation planning. And what it means is that you have a sample of all of the biodiversity that we care about protected in the network. So that's why having either species or ecosystems or habitats as a baseline is a really important way to track how we're going. This is some new, a new map that was published last year on the terrestrial ecosystems of the world. So this was published by the US Geologic Survey, and the Nature Conservancy was also involved. It was a huge collaboration of people and scientists to create this map. And why these are helpful is because it allows us, just like in the previous map, to understand how well we're doing at representing important biodiversity and different facets of biodiversity. And in this case, what we find is generally, you know, protected areas seem to be put in places around the world where people don't like to be. So they tend to be easier to establish bigger areas for protection in places that are fairly inhospitable to humans and our economic activities.
I like it.
And
so
so what we found, sorry.
This is your rock and ice, huh?
Yeah, so what we
like
found
that.
is what,
it's memorable.
yeah, when we looked at, and it's really just an overlay of the World Database on Protected Areas, which I think you'll see a map of coming up, but an overlay of that on these different ecosystems shows us that the places that have the most protection are really the rock and ice, the tip tops of mountains, and the low fertile soils where we need to grow our food or we like to live tend to be very underrepresented and underprotected. And so again, those species and ecosystems will lose out in conservation unless we're really focused on representation.
Got it.
What's helpful, I think, to think about is we use an analogy sometimes about building up a sports team. And if you were building a soccer team and you only tracked, you were evaluating players who were, trying to get on the team, and you only tracked how fast they could run. And so what you would end up with is a team of really fast runners, and you probably don't have a good goalie. And so this idea of building complementarity into how you pick players is exactly the same in how we want to think about our networks of protected areas. We want to make sure we have the best bits of everything, not just one type of system or iconic species.
Yep.
And so
a deep bench. We want a deep bench.
Yeah, and so this idea of complementarity and representation, we've put this into something called the CARE principles, and these are fairly widely used. And basically it just means that, your network is a network, and the value of every site in that network is dependent on what else is in the network, what else is selected, just like a good team in sports. So connectivity is really important. You want to make sure that systems that are connected are protected. You don't want to just protect the mangroves that house the little fish larvae. You want to also make sure that the seagrass they have to migrate to the coral reefs, where they end up living out their adult lives and maturing, are also protected. So you have to make sure you're protecting all of their life history stages, not just one part of them. Adequacy has to do really with how much you protect. So is it enough to just protect one little patch of seagrass on one little island, or do we need to make sure we have enough of that habitat type to make sure that that species and system will persist through time?
Mm-hmm.
Representation, we've talked about a lot of. It really just means you want to have a good sample of all of the different facets of biodiversity. And efficiency speaks to the socioeconomics and the political realities that we are dealing with when we're thinking about designing networks of protected areas. So you might have a place that's very important, but it's also very important to a fishing ground, fishing community, or an industrial fleet. And so that's just trying to say we can't forget about those constraints as we're thinking about designing networks.
In trying to answer that question, which half and where, I'm using the principles of systematic conservation planning that Jen just outlined to try and come up with a global reserve network that has some or as many of the properties that she just talked about. And so I wanted to very briefly go over the three basic types of information that I am using and that we need to get started in that process of systematic conservation planning. So the very first piece is essentially that WDPA data set that we've already talked about. This is what is currently protected on the landscape. We want to start with this because any kind of solution that we're coming up with, we want to be able to recognize the work that's already been done on the landscape and be able to build from there. Right, so we're not starting from scratch. We already have some portion of the landscape protected, and so we can use this and incorporate our second piece of data.
Right, biodiversity.
Right, biodiversity. So getting back to the ideas of representation and whatever kind of targets or goals we're meeting here. I think that this is a really important point, that when we're talking about protecting half of the Earth, it's not just 50% of the surface area, right? We want to get the right 50% in order to preserve the biodiversity contained therein. Otherwise, it would be very easy, right? You just like grab Antarctica and Greenland, right, and we're already most of the way there.
More rock and ice, yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And so we really need to have an understanding of where the biodiversity is distributed across the landscape. And as you can see from this map of terrestrial vertebrate species, comprising amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles, there are about 32,000 species represented here. And you can see there's very uneven distribution. And that ends up mattering a whole heck of a lot, because going back to those goals that we had, let's say we want to preserve 17% as the target. It's not simply sufficient to protect 17% of every country or 17% of each ecoregion, because the biodiversity is distributed differently. Some ecoregions are more biodiverse than others. Do we really need 17% of rock and ice? Do we only need 17% of the rainforests? No, there's going to be a fair amount of variation in there. So we really need these patterns of biodiversity in order to meet our target of preserving it.
So Scott, this richness, just to make sure we understand the scale here. So this heat map, the deepest reds, 1600, that literally means 1600 vertebrate species.
That's correct.
Okay, so right, you can see very, very hot areas here and in Africa here. Maybe a little cooler in the US, but still a lot of species richness. And then just to highlight, just to really emphasize, this is data, and I'm guessing for a couple of practical reasons. This is the vertebrate species. I guess I wonder two things. Why could you do this same map for invertebrate species? And would you think, would that map look different? Or, you know, is richness concentrated pretty much in these areas already for virtually all species, as far as we know?
Yeah. Oh, those are such great questions, Dennis. I'm really glad that you brought them up. So, right, I think when people tend to think of biodiversity on the landscape, we tend to, I mean, depending on your background, a lot of us tend to think of vertebrate species. They're big, we can see them, they're cute, they're fuzzy, et cetera, et cetera. But they're really only one small facet of the biodiversity that's out there, right? We've got invertebrates, like you said, we've got all kinds of plants. There's so many things that are not actually contained in this map. And I think if you're looking at very broad scale patterns like this, there is a fair amount of similarity in the patterns of, say, plant diversity and vertebrate diversity. We do see those similarities between them. But that said, there's still an awful lot that we simply don't know yet. You know, we're using these ones in part because these are the easy ones to do. People have been studying these organisms and gathering data on them for you know, decades or centuries. And as our technology has gotten better, you know, most of these things we can actually go out and put little GPS tags on and track their movement. You know, good luck doing that with invertebrates right now.
Yeah.
And so certainly our plan is to be adding more and more facets to our picture of biodiversity here as we get more and more information about that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, yeah. And then I don't know if you're gonna, let me just look ahead here quickly. We're gonna, so then there's another thing, and maybe you'll talk about this later, but rarity is another important aspect. And one of the reasons I raise it is because, you know, again, when I talk to audiences, and one of the big benefits of our map is, of the Half Earth map, is being able to sort of zoom in on your local area and see what things look like, and then relate it to global patterns and compare it even to other local areas if you're interested. And you know, even if you're in a place that's relatively less rich than other places, there's bound to be some rare things there. And that's one of the things you should, you know, I like to tell you, you should value that. You should be proud of that. So yeah, so richness and rarity are two sort of key things for people to be thinking about, right?
That's absolutely right. And, you know, I wish I had included it here just for comparison's sake, but there are a lot of places in which the richness map looks very different from the rarity map. Absolutely, you have hotspots of rarity around the world where there might not be all that many species, but the ones that you do have aren't found elsewhere.
Right. But again, the two, in
yeah,
your practical work, you can factor those things in. That can be part of your algorithms that you're using to do some of this decision making.
That's exactly right. Yeah, it really just depends on how you define the problem and go about solving it. Yeah. So I'll have more about that to say in just a little bit, but really quickly, I want to just briefly mention the third piece of information that I'm using, and that is really some kind of picture of the global human footprint on the landscape. Given two locations that have the same number and types of species, if one is relatively pristine habitat and one is heavily modified by human activity, all other things being equal, it's probably better to protect the more pristine habitat first, because it's going to provide more effective habitat for those species and perhaps be a little bit more robust for future changes. And so here is a sort of heat map of human activity on the landscape. It's an index that goes from 0 to 1 and is sort of taken 13 different layers and aspects of human modification. So things like population, road networks, mining activity, all these different things, and sort of compress them down into one index.
But that's important. So really trying to a multi-dimensional view of all the of most of the various ways that humans impact the landscape, well, and the seascape.
That's right.
Right. So in India here, we have a lot of, it's pretty pretty hot, heavy human impact. Northern Africa here, relatively low impact. But I do see some fire and rock, some rock and ice phenomena too in this.
Yeah, and so one really important thing that that this map illustrates is that we're going to need different solutions for different places when it comes to conservation. In lots of places where there's very little human activity and the landscape is still relatively pristine, it might be sufficient to label something a national park, create some borders, and leave it alone.
Mhm.
In other places, like India, for example, if we want to be protecting species habitat there, it's entirely likely that a great deal more restoration work will be necessary. So yeah, there's a lot of inequity in that as well. This really sort of, I think, is a great illustration of what Dennis just brought up a little bit ago about the idea of richness versus rarity, and how it is that you go about formulating the type of problem, and how that can impact the type of answers that you get out of it. So this is a figure that I found in a paper at some point over the last couple of years, and I think it does a fantastic job at illustrating this. So what we have here is a landscape divvied up into 100 different grid cells and distributed across the landscape. We've got 16 different sort of cartoon example species. Each one of those is represented by a different letter inside the grid cell. So you see some grid cells have more species, some species have fewer. Species that are considered rare are the ones that are, the letters are in red there. And I think their qualification of rareness is like it's in 5 squares or fewer. And so depending on how we want to go about protecting these species, we're going to get these different answers. So let's say, for example, that you are looking here at patterns of species richness. You say, I want to protect the places with the most number of species. Well, just going through and doing the simple counts of them, you end up in the white squares, I believe. That if you protect those 3 squares, that you've got at least one of each species. Maybe not. I don't see B in there. But it gives you something, right? You have the most overall number of species in there, but you didn't manage to capture quite everything.
It's a big richness score, though.
Yeah. Conversely, if you want to focus your attention on the locations of greatest species rarity, you want to look for the grid cells that have the most number of species that are labeled in red. And so then our attention gets drawn to the cells in yellow. And if we protect all of those, we get the greatest representation of rare species, but we don't necessarily get all of the rare species, or maybe we do, but we require more land to do so. Here we grabbed 4 squares instead of 3. But if we go about this in a systematic way, via some type of sort of algorithm, instead of just staring at the landscape and all these letters until our eyes go crossed, we can actually arrive at a solution that does better in terms of the area needed and in terms of the species protected. So if you look at the 3 squares that are outlined in black, although none of those are actually the most species-rich places, and only one of them has some of the most rarity in it, nonetheless, using those 3 squares, we have been able to protect all 16 species, some amount of habitat for them, and done that using less area or equal area than either of the other 2 networks. And so this, I think, really sort of demonstrates the value of systematic conservation planning in helping us find answers that we might not have found otherwise, just paying attention to broad patterns of richness and rarity.
And is this what you call an efficient, this is an efficient solution from that perspective, because sort of most bang for the least number of squares.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when Jen earlier was mentioning the sort of political and economic realities of the world that we live in, that is a solution that is often highly desirable. Is what's the least amount of land that we need to accomplish our goals? Because land is expensive, and there are all kinds of opportunity costs that come with setting aside land for conservation in addition to the economic costs.
So is it fair to say in some ways what you're doing, if you imagine a solution like this, obviously only we're talking about real species, you take this 10 by 10 matrix, but you wrap it around the whole globe to try and come up with solutions that would be, that would be consistent with the half Earth goal.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So if you go back to that biodiversity map that we had a couple slides ago, you'd see that information is actually presented on a gridded landscape like this. Only instead of 16 species, we've got those 32,000 species in there to go through and build a network and try and meet the targets for each species. Make a network that adds up to a sufficient amount of habitat protected for each species, and to do so using the minimum amount of area, minimum amount of cost. There are all kinds of different aspects that you can play with here. And what I think this really illustrates well is there's no way to really go about this just sort of clicking around on the map.
That's a pretty big, that's a pretty big number there.
Yeah. So if you wanted to do an exhaustive search of all of this and figure out what are all of the different possible combinations of 100 grid cells, you get that enormous number at the bottom. And there's literally not enough time in the history of the universe, both past and future, in order to go through all of those possible combinations. So clearly, we need some kind of quantitative tool that helps us find these optimal solutions in a systematic and an efficient way. And so the idea here is that the algorithms that we're using in systematic conservation planning do exactly that. And they sort of, in some sense, remove the subjective human element from it. We're no longer just staring at a map and saying like, oh, maybe this place looks good, maybe this place. Once you set up the problem, once you formulate it and get an answer out, there is some objectivity to that. Namely, you can take the same data, set up the problem the same way on your end, and end up at the exact same answer because it's an algorithm that you used to get there. And it's based upon the principles of efficiency and repeatability. And again, sort of transparency. The first species that we're going to focus on here is the Blandings turtle. It is relatively widespread throughout the Midwestern United States, a little bit into New England there. But so this is just the sort of the whole entire range map. But we're actually going to zoom in a little bit to the state of Wisconsin. And we are focusing on here because even though it's distributed all throughout the state, the population inside there isn't actually doing all that well. And so within Wisconsin, it's considered to be a threatened species. And so it has some conservation interest there. So let's say that we're in charge of the state of Wisconsin, and we are in charge of implementing some kind of conservation plan for this species. And let's say that we've decided that 25% of its habitat is sufficient to ensure the safeguarding of Blandings turtle. Well, since from this map, it is distributed all across Wisconsin, 25% of its habitat essentially means 25% of the state. So the first thing that we want to do is divvy up the landscape into a sort of gridded pattern like what we were looking at before. And we want to bring in our three different layers that I talked a little about before. So we can look at what's already protected in the state. So I believe it's about, a little bit less than 9% is currently protected. Okay, so we're already part of the way there. Now we just need to figure out what more we need to protect and where in order to meet those goals. Finally, we can look at the patterns of human modification of the landscape. Say, oh, okay, well, a lot of the human activity is found in the southern and southeastern part of the state. So maybe if we protect up higher in the north, it's more pristine habitat, that turtle population will do a little bit better. And so we can run it through our algorithm that gives us our optimal answer. So these cells that are highlighted in red is the solution that we're looking at. And this tells us if we protect the land that is contained in those cells, along with the amount that's currently protected, we will meet our goal of 25% of the species habitat, having also minimized the amount of human modification inside there. And so I think the next slide just sort of gets rid of all that color, just so you can see that a little bit more clearly.
Right, so that's an efficient solution because you've got, in this case, you have the whole state to play with, since the turtle can be found anywhere, but you have a high concentration of already protected land up in this area, and low human modification.
That's exactly right, yeah. Okay, and so that's an example for one species. Well, we're gonna do the same thing again for another species. In this case, we're looking at the greater prairie chicken. Some overlap in habitat, common sort of a little bit further west in the Midwest, but we also have some sparse population inside Wisconsin.
Yeah.
It's not all over the state, however. It looks like we've got sort of more isolated pockets there. So let's say, once again, same goal, we want to protect 25% of the greater prairie chicken's habitat. Okay? So we get the gridded landscape, get what's currently protected, get human modification, run our algorithm, and we end up with this solution. And removing that human modification, again, just to sort of show what we're doing, we can see it grabs some of the locations where we find the greater prairie chicken. And this again meets our goal of 25% habitat. So that's for that single species. Now, what does it look like if we take the solution that we got for the greater prairie chicken and the solution that we got for the Blandings turtle and combine them together? This is the reserve network that we end up with. Okay? But it's important to notice this is not an optimal solution in terms of the minimum amount of area needed, right? We've treated these two species independently of one another and not taken advantage of the fact that because Blandings turtle is everywhere in the state, anywhere we're protecting the greater prairie chicken, we're also protecting Blanding turtle habitat. And so if we were to set up the optimization problem and run our algorithm so that it's taking into account both species distributions simultaneously, we can actually get a more efficient solution. On the next slide here. Yeah, we see it selects some different locations, but the important point here is that we need less land than just the sum total of both of those in order to meet our goals for both species. And so that's really the principle of complementarity in action, that we can sort of leverage the overlap between species ranges to find our most efficient solutions.
Yeah,
and
I think that's
a principle that, oh, go ahead.
No, well, that's a great point, because it can feel like as you add species, you're just going to have to keep adding land, adding water. So I think it's a super important point, given the real patterns of how species are distributed, that there's trade-offs, and that in some cases you actually get efficiency benefits, right, from a given parcel of land. It's a very interesting way to think about the problem.
That's right. And so extending this principle to the global perspective, I think the key takeaway here is that if we are smart and strategic in our placement of these protected areas in the reserve network, that 50% is quite likely to be sufficient for protecting the vast majority of biodiversity. But we do need to be strategic about it.
Right. No, that's great. And then, right, and of course, this is just two species. As you add a third, you could, just to double down on your point about needing computers, it's essential that you understand, you know, and hopefully that listeners understand this process. But in the end, you're going to have to turn it over to a computer, which also has the other advantage that you can tweak a variable or change something and model different outcomes. Because of course, Jen's going to get to this in a little bit. It's great to have these model solutions, but then there's how do you get them to happen in the real world is a whole nother important piece of this.
So we're going to jump from North America over to the middle of the Coral Triangle. And the Coral Triangle is a place in the world that hosts the most diversity of marine species and coral reef and tropical fish from anywhere on the planet. And it really is a boundary around the oceanic system that includes the Philippines, Malaysia, Indonesia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and the Solomon Islands. And the island of Borneo is split into 3 different countries. So we're talking about the Malaysian part of Borneo, which is in the far north. If you just go back quickly. Yeah, so you'll see on the panel on the left, kind of where we're sitting in the South China Sea. And that boundary, the blue boundary, is Tun Mustafa Marine Park. This was planned to be one of the big flagship marine parks of the entire Coral Triangle. So the government of Malaysia was committed to doing this systematic conservation planning for a multi-objective plan in the heart of the Coral Triangle, where there are millions of people who depend on the oceans for their livelihoods and for their food security.
Yeah.
The map just on the right is the distribution of coral reefs in the region. And so you can see that, you know, coral reefs aren't just one color. There's a lot of different types of coral reefs. There's a lot of different patch reefs and fringing reefs and sheltered reefs. And all of those reefs have different species that are associated with them. So it's a very tightly coupled kind of habitat species system. So the planning project, you can move forward. The planning project was really set out to be a stakeholder-driven process. So we had to be working with government, we had to be working with communities. We were working with a local NGO, so the World Wildlife Fund in Malaysia was driving a lot of this in partnership with the government. And these regions are also, they tend to be pretty data deficient. We have some maps of habitats. We don't have surveys of all of the species that are there. We have information maybe from where a particular survey has been done by a university, but it usually isn't comprehensive across the entire planning region. And so this idea that we're really working with limited information in a lot of countries where we desperately need to be doing conservation planning. And I would say in the marine systems, it's even worse than on terrestrial systems, because it's not the environment that we live in and observe on a daily basis. So, so this is pretty common, and I just wanted to show, you know, there's a couple different layers of data, some related to species, like the example that Scott showed, some related to habitats, like the coral reefs, and some are related to historic cultural sites. So you'll see on the bottom of this list, there's historical sites and the Balambangan limestone caves. And it was really important to the communities that these limestone caves were in the strictest form of protection, because they really didn't want to have any threat or pressure from human activities or exploitation or industry coming into what is their really important cultural site.
Right, so high cultural value to them.
Yeah, and so it's not just, sometimes conservation planning isn't necessarily always just about species and habitats and biodiversity. There's a lot of things that can go into it. So if you just click one more time, I think we should see. Yes, so the orange data are data that came from traditional ecological knowledge through surveys with communities that are spread throughout this region. So these are not satellite data sets. These are not modeled systems. This was going through and asking elders what their information of where the turtles are found feeding in the region. And
so recording interviews and wow.
Yeah, so through questionnaires and through surveys and through maps, and then 58 different villages were surveyed to get that information, because who better to ask than the people that have been living there their whole lives. So we wanted to incorporate that as much as we possibly could. And the other thing, I think if you click one more time, this is where we get into the idea. So now we have our kind of our data sets that we know want to feed into this, and we have different types of zones. So in conservation planning, when you often have, land and seascapes that have to serve multiple functions. You need to have conservation of biodiversity sitting alongside traditional fishing areas, sitting along agricultural zones, or aquaculture zones. And so what we did here was we looked at an optimization across multiple zones with different objectives. And so here we had a preservation zone. That was the strictest form of conservation protection. So nothing happens there. They're considered no take. And we wanted to make sure that those limestone caves and historical sites, 100% of those were found in that particular preservation zone. And then we move over into community use zones. And that was really about, that zone is intended to preserve the traditional fishing grounds of the communities that live in this region who depend on fish. And then there's a multiple use zone, which is where we have some other non-extractive industries happening, like recreation or dive tourism, that can sit alongside the other zones. And they all have different targets. So in this case, we wanted you see just above the coral reefs, it's quite small, I apologize, but there's a traditional small scale fishing ground. We put that in as one of the data layers to make sure that we could ensure that none of the small scale traditional fishing grounds were actually put into the no-take protection preservation zone. So it becomes complicated, and what you're seeing here is a bridging of science and art and planning. I mean, the science is there to underpin us and give the best data that we can find, but this largely becomes a political process very quickly because it's people who are making the decisions, right? The algorithms give us the good solutions, but it's people who make these decisions. So if you go to the next slide, I'll just show you what that looked like. So we took this information and we ran it through our algorithm. And up here on the far left corner, that's the output from the algorithm. And so you'll see it's kind of patchy and kind of blobby, and you'll see the green areas are the preservation zones, the community use areas are the traditional fishing areas. Those seem to be pretty coastal and clumped up next to where the communities are. And then the multiple use zone is kind of almost everywhere outside of there because there's not a lot of constraints placed on that. There's diving and recreation. And so what happens there is you have your algorithm and your data, and you create an output and you create a map, and then it goes to the decision makers. And in this case, the first in line to review this plan was the park system, whose primary objective and the lens at which they're looking at this through is, can we enforce this? And so how do we draw boundaries that we think are feasible for us to be monitoring and enforcing? And they have their own constraints and their own budgets, and they're limited by the number of boats that they have, right? So we see the evolution from the optimal plan, given the science and the data and the problem that we were trying to solve, change into something very, very different, which is really about the feasibility of enforcement and that first step of review. And then they went through a 2-year process where now we'd have the science, we've had the Parks Authority, and now it was time to go get the stakeholders' opinions. And so they went back out to all of those villages and they showed them the plans and they talked them through what was happening and they incorporated their feedback. And so we see it change even more. We see it change again to where we have a lot more preservation zones that are much smaller. And guess what? They're also pushed offshore. And that's very strategic because you don't really want to have a no-take area next to where you live. The trade-off there, though, is that we start to miss out on high protection value for the coastal ecosystems. So for the sea turtle nesting and the dugong habitat and the seagrasses and the corals that are really tightly up against the coastline tend to fall out of their protection levels and start missing their targets. And so ultimately, it's this type of iterative process that we aspire to in conservation planning, because it really is bringing in the best science, bringing in the decision support, but also allowing multiple voices to be heard and trying to accommodate as many different objectives and values as you can. And this is, I think, a really good example of how that has happened. And this park was declared, I believe, in 2016.
Oh.
And we have a 5-year monitoring plan. So we go back and we try and assess every 5 years what the condition of the corals, is it improving? What did we miss? And the idea is that this is an adaptive process. These zones are working now. They might not be working in the future with climate change and new industries coming into the fold. And so the beautiful thing about having a framework like this is it's very transparent, and you can go back and you know exactly what went into every decision along the way has been documented. And so you can go back and use that framework and the same algorithm with different data and readjust through time as needed. And that's why, conservation planning is a bit more of an art or a social science than a hardcore science. But the algorithms are so instrumental to starting the dialogue and also helping us frame the problem as a starting point. So
yeah, I really like that progression of, sort of this sort of thing based on what Scott was talking about primarily, and then you move to this blockier, simplified in some ways, real world, but then you have to have this community dialogue, so you end up with something like this. But I like that, as you were saying, there's lots of compromises here, but now you have a park and you have some protection in place. And of course it could go both ways, but on the one hand you could say, under this plan, the dugongs aren't doing as well as we might like. Are there some actions we could take that would support that? I think that's a great real world example.
Conservation planning and the challenges that we're facing today require a really diverse group of skills. And so whether it's an interest in economics or in biology or even in social sciences, there is a role to play in this field. And we're stronger because of the diversity of minds that care. And so I think that we're in a position now more than ever before where it doesn't matter if you like mathematics or political science, you can apply it and you can contribute to help solve these problems, which are so desperately needed right now.
If we're looking to build a better world and translate our environmental science into outcomes like environmental action and environmental justice, that education is one of our most powerful tools that we have. And it's really about transforming and bringing up to speed the next generation and instilling these values and interests and passion in young minds and helping them spread that message. So specifically, I want to say to the educators, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. I think it's incredibly important.
Great. Well, thank you guys both. Those are great parting messages, that there's room for all kinds of thinkers and doers and people with different backgrounds. And of course, we have to be in this for the long haul. There's lots and lots to learn, and yet we all feel this sense of urgency. So for my part, I'm just really happy that folks like you are working away at this, and let's keep at it. So thanks so much.
Thank you, Dennis.
Talk to you later.
Thank you, Jen.